Good morning, and welcome to the home of Unitarian Universalism in Central Washington. My name is Chris Rader, and I serve on the Greeter, Buildings and Grounds, and Worship teams. I'll be your celebrant this morning. If you're a visitor this morning, we're so glad you're here. We welcome every person of goodwill, just as you are. Whatever body you inhabit, whomever you love, whatever your age, you're welcome here. We invite everybody to join us for coffee, treats, and conversation after the service, both in person and on Zoom. For the folks on Zoom, you'll find the order of service and lyrics to the songs in the chat. So we begin our worship today by acknowledging that we live on, and our fellowship building is located on, the ancestral homeland of the Piscosa. For thousands of years, the Piscosa have been stewards of this land, fishing, hunting, gathering roots and berries and medicinal plants, and practicing cultural traditions. The Piscosa still live here. We acknowledge that their land has been taken over because the US government broke treaty obligations and carelessly allowed uninvited white colonizers to settle here. We stand alongside our indigenous neighbors as they continue their traditions and seek to have all their rights recognized. We acknowledge our shared responsibility to sustain right relations with each other and the land. For more on this subject, please visit our website, cascadeuu.org, and look for Land Acknowledgement under Welcome. And now a few words from Buddhist writer Suzanne Salzberg. Buddhist teachings say that when you offer your merit to others, your own merit grows. By giving this energy away, you get more. Happiness does not go away when we share it. It's not a limited commodity that has to be somehow rationed out and conserved very carefully so as not to deplete our supply. It grows simply because the act of sharing puts us in touch with its source, which is limitless.
In that interfaith mode, I wanted to mention this is the third day of Hanukkah. As we light our chalice, remember the many Jewish families who have lit candles on 8 successive nights as reminders of when the temple in Jerusalem was defiled and then recaptured and then cleansed and rededicated by the Jewish people centuries ago. Despite all that divides, all that oppresses, all that separates, we rededicate ourselves to upholding religious freedom. Our flame, like those of the menorah, speak to us of embodying justice, equity, compassion, generosity, and compassion in this world. If at home you have a chalice with you, please join with us in lighting it as we say these words. In the light of truth and the warmth of love, we gather to seek and seek to share. To fully gather ourselves together, both in body and spirit and mind, I invite you to stand up and to sing a song that was very popular back in the 1976, when it reached the top of the charts and has continued to resonate over all the years. Let your love flow. Unitarian Universalism, of which we are one small part of a great mighty stream. Unitarian Universalism has a history going back at least 3,000 years by my count. Universalism of one sort or another is very ancient and universal. And Christian Universalism is as old as Christianity and was the most popular form of Christianity in its early days. Moreover, congregations that formed with the name Universalist are older than the United States. And the first congregations with the name Unitarian started over hundreds of years ago. Then about 400 years in Transylvania, and over 100 years here. Then about 63 years ago, the Unitarians and the Universalists in this country merged into the UU Association. In some minds, we represent an extreme liberal edge of religion, and for others, we represent the vital center of what is best and most true and most inclusive of all ways of faith. But the important fact for us today is that the first worship service of Cascade UU it was Unitarian initially, but it's now Cascade UU Fellowship, was in 1985 on Sunday, November 17th. That means we are 3 weeks into our 39th year in Wenatchee Valley. Okay? And in honor of those people who gathered back in 1985, and in celebration of our collective birthday, I want to recognize those who were at that first service and are still here by asking them to stand as I read their names. Ben Connect, okay. Larry, go ahead and, Larry Toviska and Penny Toviska. Okay. Yeah, I'll have you all stand up in the end, but rather than force them to stand because we're all going to standing for a while. Then Elliot Skull. Is Elliot here? I can't remember. I thought he was going to be here. Gene Kufferman, Leroy Farmer, and Sandy Farmer. So now I want all those founding people to stand up, all those people who are early at that first service. And then I want anyone who joined this congregation and became active in this congregation within the next 10 years after that to also stand. So a number of significant people who are part of that. Right? And then anyone who joined by the year 2000. So anyone here who became a part of this congregation, active in this congregation by the year 2000. And then anyone who joined within 2000 to 2010, bringing music and also that. And then anyone who joined between 2010 and 2020. And then even since the pandemic, there have been people who have joined. So anyone else who is a part of this congregation to stand up. What they started, what the small group started back in 85 continues vibrantly and fully. I also want you to remember that I always think of children as members of the congregation. They're not voting members. They don't become adult voting members until a certain age. But I always consider any child a part of the congregation, a member of the congregation, as important of my time and energy as anything else, anyone else. Today we don't seem to have children gathered in, but if you know families with children, we want those people to come here, no matter who they are. Invite them in and bring them to the services. So today I'm wearing my gaudiest of Santa ties. And one evening I was driving home at twilight, a different city. And on the intimate front porch, those little porches, just a few steps and one little place for 2 or 3 people to stand, there was a life-size creche. Baby Jesus is there, laying in his little cradle, arms open to the porch light shining down on him. And his parents are there looking on in kind of peaceful, happy reverence. And on the steps going up to the porch were the wise men, and then there were some shepherds standing there and all in kind of quiet, mellow colors, illuminated by the porch light. But then in the front of the house, out on the grass, on the lawn, there was Santa. Santa was standing up in his sleigh, not just sitting in his sleigh, he was standing in his sleigh with his hands up, waving, his back turned to Jesus, waving at all the cars going by, and his deer and his sled, and he were all glowing from this inner light, this bright inner light. And I couldn't tell if the owner of the house was intentionally or unintentionally making a really ironic statement about the nature of Christmas in America, trying to be reverent and joyful at the same time, and not really meshing well. The fundamentalist Christian response might be to take down that Santa statue and take down the tinsel and stop all profligate and material gift giving and denial, all the partying. But I like Santa. I'm kind of glad he was there. And then one evening I was at a Chinese restaurant, about the same year. And I was at a cash register. It was one of those restaurants where you go up to the cash register to pay. And I was waiting at the cash register, and I noticed this huge, rotund, bald guy, a statue behind the cashier. Now, at that point, I had been studying Buddhism very seriously. I've been engaged in Buddhist practice for over a decade. And I suddenly thought, who is this guy? I knew that he was called the Laughing Buddha. I'd seen him my whole life, this big, fat, bald guy, laughing, obviously Chinese guy. But why is he called the Laughing Buddha? What does he have to do with Buddhism at all? Very curious. I mean, the Buddha always has this curly hair, and this guy's bald. And the Buddha is always very slender and composed, either in a very straight sitting pose or standing, giving the teaching gesture, or maybe reclining in a way of relax and hopefulness, but not this guy who just seems to be really enjoying himself, and they somehow didn't fit together. And I imagine that if there were fundamentalist Buddhists, which there kind of can be, that they would really not like this fat guy. I wonder, why is he there? Now, since I'm speaking about Buddhists, I'll say that I've learned that Buddhists cannot be blues guitarists. Do you know why? It's because Buddha taught there is no soul. And you have to know a little bit about Buddhism to be able to understand that joke. And then I was going to point out that Buddhists also cannot ever vacuum in corners because they don't have any attachments. As I began to explore Buddhism, I both learned the silliness of those sort of jokes, but I also learned more about who Hotei was. My first insight, and as I was thinking about Buddha, and then I was thinking back to that Santa who was in the front lawn, I began to realize that Hotei is to Buddha as Santa is to Jesus. Both Hotei and Santa are inspired by minor historical people who are linked to a central religious leader and practice. But more than that, they embody an essential truth that deepens the message of the better known, more famous, popular religious leader. Jesus teaches about serving the one true God, while Santa gives gifts of happiness and fixes little problems. Likewise, Buddha gives profound teachings about liberation of the mind, the cultivation of discipline and character, merit, while Hotei says, relax, enjoy the journey. I say, listen to these big men, notice their smiles, remember as you see them what Frank Baum, the creator of Oz, said, in all this world there is nothing so beautiful as the smile of a happy child. Understand that they both tell you, affirm what makes you laugh joyfully as part of your whole self. Share with others, be generous without expectations, give, find ways in being in the world that lightens your heart and forms deeper connections. Let laughter and silly gifts lead you to that much deeper and greater joy that passes all understanding. So the Laughing Buddha, Hotei, as far as we can tell, was inspired by an eccentric 9th century, back in the 1800s, 9th century or 800s, Chinese monk. His Chinese nickname, Buddhai, means little linen sack. And I think that's from his name, Buddhai, that people refer to him as a Buddha. But he was Buddhist. He was part of the Buddhist tradition in the 800s. And the Japanese, when stories about him came to their island, called him Hotei. And I prefer that name. I like Hotei. He was a rebel. He was a wandering monk who lived without rules. He ate abundantly. He always asked for his favorite. He didn't just, usually Buddhist practice just accept whatever comes to you. He would ask, hey, you got some meat? I like fish. You can give me some of that too, he would say. Always when he came to a village, he was always carrying a sack. He carried a sack with him wherever he went. That's why he got the Chinese nickname Budai. And in that sack, he would have little trinkets and treats which he would give out to the children. And then as they gathered around, then he'd say, so what are we going to do? And he'd play, soccer, whatever kind of games they played, play games with them, or just chase and tag and freeze tag. Who knows what they played? But he would always play with the children first. He loved children. He got along with them incredibly well, small children, small human beings, and then would hang out with others and have feasts and enjoy life. They say that people noticed that he always seemed to have something in his sack, no matter how much he gave away. And over time, that became the myth that it was an ever-flowing, ever-abundant sack. But when needed, he would use that sack as a sleeping bag because he was homeless. He was truly homeless in a world that allowed for religious mendicants to just wander and be free. He was, as a wandering monk, he did have to accept some of the demands of that life. And there is a story that one day, a man looked at him, a homeowner, who looked at Budai and saw this bum who was just taking away from the goodness and the hard work of others. And we know about these people in this world who are kind of rather critical about the poor and the needy and assuming that all of them are nothing but bums. And so he walks up to Budai, walks up to Hotei, and then to Hotei, and he says, tell me, what is enlightenment? Koan is a form of question and answer that's part of the Buddhist tradition. And he says, what is enlightenment? And Budai just took his sack and he drops it on the ground. And he opens his hands and he smiles at this man, just smiles at him. His arms open. And the man can't tell if this is an evasion of the question or just a surrender. He doesn't know exactly what's going on. So he said, so then tell me, how does one achieve enlightenment? And Hotei reaches down and he picks up the sack and he turns his back on this crabby, negative guy and walks away from him. Leave the sources of suffering behind. That's the message of that. Don't cling to anything too tightly. Be open to the world. Turn your back on negativity. Over the centuries, Budai became one of the Chinese 7 good luck gods. He's always carrying an ever full sack. He was emblematic, and it still is, of contentment and abundance and a jovial spirit. Traveling Americans really liked this Budai, this laughing Buddha. They called him the laughing Buddha, and they brought him to American shores, not understanding really that much about Buddha or Hotei. They just liked his smile. They liked his happiness, his big belly of abundant good luck. Very much like Hotei, Santa Claus also grew from a historical person. It was a 4th century Christian, Saint Nicholas, Bishop of Myrna. There really is very little or no historical evidence anchoring Saint Nicholas, the bishop of that place, to anything. But Christian practice included the veneration of Saint Nicholas in Christian practice by the year 400. So within the first few hundred years, he was well known. His name was shared by many. He was believed to have been born someplace around 280 in Greece. He was known as a Greek. He has this Nicholas, his name. Nicholas was a Greek name, but he ended up serving as bishop in Myrna, which is now on the southern coast of Turkey, western Turkey. He was much admired right on the shore. He was much known for piety, very pious person, but also for his kindness and generosity, and encouraging kindness and generosity wherever he went. He became the subject of many legends and stories. He was most known for giving anonymous gifts to help people in desperate need, and these stories resonated, just like our sharing today, the sharing about people serving those who are hungry, serving those who may not have as much as others. Something compelling, something powerful about someone who is generous and kind. There's perhaps the most famous story about Saint Nicholas was there were three daughters. A man had three daughters. The mother had died in childbirth of the third, and he had raised these daughters, but he had no money. And at that time, women, in order to have a respectable marriage, had to pay a dowry to get into a family that would sustain them. Otherwise, chances are these young women would be either prostitutes or slaves of some sort or another. And the bishop knew of these people. They were members of his congregation. And so he went out and gathered money. And on 3 different nights, random nights, he came when the family was sleeping, and he dropped a bag of coins enough to make a dowry for each of the daughters one night, and then another night, and then another night, making sure that they could live lives of respectability and wellness and freedom. St. Nicholas's day of veneration is the anniversary of his death, which was December 6th. By the Renaissance, he was one of the most popular saints in all of Europe. And after the Reformation, even after the Reformation, he remained famous and well-loved as an icon of Christian kindness and generosity and helpfulness. In America, his last name was shortened to Klaus, Niklaus, and his first name became Santa. Sinterklaas was the Dutch pronunciation of his name. In the 20th century, Americans started to associate him more and more just with secular family life, with material gifts, childish, magical stories, more than Christian piety. Maybe you've seen, I saw this image a while back. It was an image of Santa. He was kneeling in the snow, and before him was a star shining, but it was a star shining like a cross, looked like a Christian cross. And he'd taken his hat off. He was holding it at his chest, and his head was bowed. And there was something really disturbing about this image to me. It seemed incongruous. It's like all his joviality, all his joy had been lost under the demands of piety. And the image of the cross was an image of capital execution in the Roman times. It just seemed like a kind of, like someone had missed the point, which is that when you practice your way of living, you practice living well, you need to be able to laugh. You need to have some lightness of spirit. It's not all about sackcloth and ashes, as the scriptures say. So again, my point is that Santa is to Jesus as Hotei is to Buddha. They're loosely connected. But the two minor figures remind you of something that is absolutely essential if you are going to follow the larger prophet in any sense. Even as an atheistic humanist, you may still be following the principles and the ideas of Jesus or Buddha without ascribing to them any supernatural, magical powers, and yet still understanding that what they spoke about was the quality of human character and the way that we must live on this earth. And part of that is treating children well, is bringing joy into people's lives, is sharing generously. Don't forget, says both Hotei and Santa, don't forget these things in the midst of all the difficulties of this life. Every year about this time, I talk a little bit about stress and sadness and grief. The point of a holiday is not to banish sadness, it is not to deny it, but to temper darkness, joy, and light. A long time ago, I had a friend whose grandmother had died. The grandmother had died on Christmas Day. And the grandfather, left alone with two sons, decided to raise them with no Christmas. Christmas was banished from their house. Christmas was a day of mourning. It was a day of loss. And the boys grew up with that to some extent, but they were living in a culture in which that was not the message all around them. And so when one of those boys grew up. He loved being Santa. My friend's father laughed in Christmas night. Ho, 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 he'd say. The children would hear that voice that was familiar and yet mysterious. He loved that message of joy and happiness and possibilities despite the pain and loss even of his own life. Tension always in spirituality is that life is short and brutal and tragic, and yet can be so full of generous laughter and kindness and unending joy. We're all caught between desire and nirvana, Tana and nirvana, between sin and weeping and gnashing of teeth and salvation and eternal joy. I heard a story on NPR a while back of a woman who was part of it. There's an agency whose entire work was to get poor Palestinian children treatment for fatal illnesses like cancer, to give them life, to give them hope, to take children and take them to a good hospital where they would be well treated and their lives may be saved. And there was one in the story in NPR, they mentioned this one woman who had just always found this feeling that her life as a Jewish person was made more full because of what she was doing, that was fulfilling her religious duties. And then when the war started, this most recent violent outburst of a war that's been going on basically since the beginning of Israel, when it burst back into horrible violence and children were dying, she, of course, said, I can't do this work anymore. There's no ferrying children across borders to hospitals. But very soon after that, the people that she worked with said, we must do this work. We have to continue this work. We need to be generous and loving and kind despite the violence of war, despite the fear of division and hatred. We must be something else in the world. They may have never heard of Hotei before, never seen that little guy laughing, or maybe they had, and the message was coming across. Just continue to bring smile. I have gone to Shriner hospitals and known children who have been treated well in moments of sickness, or they lose all their hair and they're fighting with cancer, and yet it's still about toys and joy and fun, trying to live the fullest life you can, no matter how short it will be. I came across a poem a couple years back by Mary Oliver. It fits perfectly, I think, with this sentiment. If you suddenly and unexpectedly feel joy, don't hesitate. Give into it. There are plenty of lives. There are whole towns destroyed or about to be. We are not wise. We're not often very kind. And much can never be redeemed. Still, life has some possibility left. Perhaps this is its way of fighting back, that sometimes something happens better than all the riches or power in the world. It could be anything, but very likely you notice it at the instant when love begins. Anyway, that's often the case. Anyway, whatever it is, don't be afraid of its plenty. Joy is not meant to be a crumb. I like that. Spirituality, well-being is big, expansive, active, all-embracing like Santa's hug, as full and endless as Hotei's sack. Sometimes we are so busy seeking crumbs, thinking there's only little bits of happiness, that we miss the feast of joy. Sometimes small moments of laughter, the bright face of a happy child, open us to the surprise of the deep joy in all things. And hopefully, gathering together in this community intensifies that and strengthens that for all of us, and helps us to go and share that joy with others, that generosity of spirit, that kindness with others.
We will extinguish our chalice. And as we do, please join in saying the words, printed in your order of service or on the screen. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. And now let's form a circle around the chairs and we'll sing our very closing song.